Hello everyone, my name is Catherine Gallinger and this tutorial will focus on the historical construction of disability and normalcy. So we'll be looking at the Disability Studies Student Guide, Chapters 21, Historical Construction of Disability, Chapter 34, Normalcy, Chapter 4, Alienation, and the article from Leonard Davis, Disability, Normality, and Power. The historical construction of disability refers to the ways in which societies have defined and treated people with disabilities throughout history. These constructions are shaped through the cultural, religious, economic, and political factors throughout time and location, and they are constantly evolving throughout time. So what this means is that disability, ideas about disability um, affect how disability is perceived and responded to. And as a historical construction, ideas about disability can change over time based on common knowledge and expectations for people who have disabilities throughout time. Um, this is largely tied as well with the social construction of disability perspective, which views disability not just as a medical condition, but also as the result of the interaction between individuals and their environment. So, this social construction emphasizes that societal attitudes, including physical barriers, policies, how disability is responded to, um, has a significant role in how disability is perceived and how people experience disability. So throughout history, disability has been responded through in various ways, depending on common knowledge and ideas of the given time. At some points throughout history, disability was looked at uh, as a moral punishment or divine punishment, where people would then separate themselves from people who had disabilities for fear that they didn't want to be associated with that punishment. Or at other times when people with disabilities were seen as being a gift given by God, then people would want to care for them or position themselves closer to people so that they can be seen as being good in the eyes of God. However, in the chapter, Cameron talks about how he quotes. People with impairments have been a part of every human society since the beginning of recorded history, but disabled people have only been around for about the past 200 years. And that quote demonstrates sort of a turn where disability started to be thought of differently, and through the rise of science and technology, through industrialization and medicalization, whereas ideas about disability and knowledge about disabilities have changed significantly. So prior to 200 years ago, disability was more accepted as part of a community or part of just something that happens to people. But with the rise of science and medical knowledge, disability started to take on new meanings, where the disabled body was looked at as being as an object of medical treatment so that people could be fixed or rehabilitated to get closer to norms. So it's been within the past 200 years that we start to see a more medicalized approach to disability that largely impacts how people with disabilities are still perceived and responded to in society today. It's really important to understand the historical and social constructions of disability because oftentimes dominant ideas and knowledge is taken for granted, just as the way things happen. But if we look through a disability studies perspective to understand that ideas are shaped on historical factors and social constructions of how those factors impact how people experience disabilities. It allows it opens ideas for change, for positive change, to hopefully help recreate new visions of disability to help reduce harmful stereotypes and that have impacted how people have experienced how people experience their lives and how people experience disabilities within communities. Pre-industrial societies were largely agrarian or small-scale cottage industries where family-based work and commerce with small towns and villages and collaboration among families within communities. So within pre-industrial societies, disabled people were often integrated into their communities along with their families. They were as such, they weren't seen as a separate category, but rather as part of a broader social fabric where disability was expected and responded to through family support. This meant that they received support and care from families in their communities, which also helped them to participate in the life of the community. So their expectations, they may have had certain expectations for participating in the community, but basically they would participate and contribute to the best of their abilities. And that was expected that they would do what they can and that families would take care of their family members um, with that disability. In pre-industrial societies, there was no focus on, there was less of a focus on medicalization because there was not the medical knowledge during these times. So emphasis was on helping to support people to contribute in the best ways that they can. However, what the expectations were may have varied. So they may have had lower expectations depending on the person's abilities, but nonetheless, they would have a particular place and an expectation for contributing to the best of their ability. Um, So usually in pre-industrial societies, generally social attitudes towards disability were more accepting and more inclusive. So people with disabilities were often valued for their unique contributions and were not necessarily stigmatized to the same extent that they have been through the medicalization of disability. Um, Overall disability in pre-industrial societies may have been characterized by more integrated approaches for people with a focus on community and care rather than medical interventions or exclusions, which through industrialization, there was an increase of technology and an increased use of machines. So factories started to be erected, and factories would produce products to sell for people, and people would want to get employment in these factories so that they could sell their labor for wages. So during this time, there was an increased demand in pace and an expected output for people to participate in the factory work. So the purpose of factory work was to generate as much capital as possible for the manufacturers, and therefore people who were seen as fast and fit and could have the most output were the ones who could secure employment and get jobs in these factories. And there was a lot of competition for work because the goal was to sell more product. So during this time, disabled bodies were often excused from work expectations due to the perception that they could not keep up pace with the demands of this fast-paced technology in the factory system. The capitalist system or the factory system placed a high value on productivity and efficiency, and disabled people were often seen as being less capable of meeting those demands, which led to their exclusion from many job opportunities. And with that exclusion came the expectation for participation. So this was justified by the belief that disabled people could not contribute economically in the same way as non-disabled individuals. During this time, as people were also moving to cities to secure employment, this led to different perspectives or different responses to disability. So, as people were leaving their rural homes and moving to cities, that often left people with disabilities at home with nobody to provide care in the same way. And disabled people who moved to cities were also becoming more visible. So, as more people moved to urban areas to work in the factories, the number of visible disabilities increased. And because of the growing issues or the growing problems of having disabled people in the cities, this often led to segregation because they were considered to be less capable of contributing to the workforce and had little expectations to do so. Um, so the lack of expectation for participating in the workforce also contributed to economic exclusion. So because the rise of capitalism during industrialization emphasized productivity and efficiency, people with disabilities were excluded from the workforce and thus were not able to earn a wage or participate in the economics of a society. So again, the marginalization that's experienced through the lack of economic participation, um, this marginalization reinforced negative stereotypes and further isolated people with disabilities from society. And because people with disabilities were perceived as being less capable to be productive and efficient in the workplace, there started to become that medicalized focus on disabilities to think about rehabilitating people with disabilities so that they could maximize their potential for participating in the workplace. As the city started to grow, people with disabilities were also perceived to be more of a burden on society because they weren't participating in the workplace and then did not have anywhere to go. So the issue of how to provide supports and services for people with disabilities came up, and that eventually resulted in them to be removed from society into places such as workhouses, asylums, or institutions that would to take care of their perceived needs and also to remove them from a society where they were seen as not being able to contribute to. So as these cities, as people moved to cities and as these cities grew, they started to be built without disability in mind. So cities didn't need to take into account a disabled body or how to be accommodating for different types of bodies because people with disabilities were not part of that landscape in the creating of cities. As such, public buildings such as schools, hospitals, business places of leisure dwellings, etc., didn't take any into account any needs of people who have disabilities who are there, therefore now becoming invisible. So, some of the earliest institutions for people with disabilities were workhouses, poorhouses, houses of refuge, asylums, jails, hospitals, and churches. So, some of the earliest forms of care for people were provided in churches through ideas of benevolence and doing God's work and taking care of all members of society. Throughout history, jails were also used to house people with disabilities. They would often be um, housed in the basement of jails, but the problem of population through urbanization meant that the jails in these smaller places were becoming overcrowded, and then this communities started to build larger institutions to house people and take care of their presumed needs. So it was perceived to be a good thing. Institutions were originally developed to educate people to rehabilitate them in order to return to the community, but they evolved into long-term residential facilities for people with disabilities. This picture is the Aurelia Asylum for Idiots in 1876. That's what it was called as it was erected. It had several names throughout its tenure. It closed in 2009. At that time, it was called the Huronia Regional Center. At another point, it was called an Ontario Hospital School. So the names also show or demonstrate the names of these institutions demonstrate different ideas and thoughts throughout history, with the focus on being an asylum that just houses people, to a hospital school that educates people, and then a regional center that provides resources. But institutions were typically um, created or developed, erected outside of cities, away from the population, and with lots of space. And it was thought that the fresh air would help people to become healthier, fresh air and lots of space to move around. But this was one of the first ones in Ontario, the first institutions in Ontario, and that closed in 2009. Normalcy as a concept refers to the ways in which people perceive themselves in relation to others around them. It's rooted in the binary opposition of normal versus abnormal, where normalcy is used as the standard to measure and exclude those who don't fit into that within those parameters. Normal is associated with being superior or privileged and unmarked, which is a desirable condition, while abnormal is perceived to be inferior, defective, and marked. So this is creates a binary framework where the normal is valued and the abnormal becomes marginalized. For people with disabilities, this has a significant negative impact. The body of the disabled person is often seen by the normal observer as being marked by the disability. Um, this perception reinforces the idea that disability is undesirable and different from the norm. As a result, normalcy regulates and measures normal bodies against those that are considered undesirable. Um, because Leonard talks about, as quoted in Cameron, that disability is not just a physical condition, but part of a historically constructed discourse, which is a way about thinking about the body, and that has changed over time and throughout time. So this discourse shapes societal attitudes towards disability, and frames it as something currently to be pitied or fixed, or something to be overcome. Normalcy in chapter 34, Cameron discusses that the pursuit of normality requires hiding away and denying any human difference. This drive to conform to societal standards and norms often means that those who do not fit within those narrow definitions of normal must suppress or disguise or hide their unique characteristics in order to fit into what is considered the norm and the desirable condition of the norm. For people with disabilities, this can translate into significant social pressures to minimize or cover up their impairments in order to or minimize them in order to be more accepted by society. Cameron talks about that people with disabilities may feel compelled to hide their disabilities or downplay their needs in order to avoid negative perceptions or presumptions, stigma, and discrimination. And this constant effort to appear normal can have a negative impact on people's mental and emotional well being and health. It can reinforce the notion that disability is something undesirable or shameful or something that people um, should stay away from or not be associated with, rather than being a natural part of human diversity. Um, Cameron talks about challenging these ideas and abandoning these expectations for obtaining normality can take a lifetime. He says that the journey towards self-acceptance and rejecting societal norms can take a long time. It's very long, it can be long and arduous. Many people with disabilities are well into adulthood before they embrace identities and can and fully resist the pressure to conform. Um, the process itself, as described by Cameron, involves um, unlearning internalized ableism that has impact someone throughout their life, being able to advocate for one's rights, and finding communities or groups of people who celebrate and support difference and diversity. In addition to personal struggles, pursuit for normalcy requires systemic changes to create a more inclusive society. Um, Efforts to promote universal design, accessibility, and inclusive policies and practices can help to dismantle some of these dominant ideologies about normalcy, and can create more inclusive environments that are more accommodating for all people, by challenging the binary of normalcy and moving towards accessible environments that are inclusive. Um, that involves interrogating what normalcy means, what does it mean, what are the values behind that, interrogating that, positing positive alternatives, acknowledging that impairments are a natural form of diversity within groups, and celebrating difference. Alienation, as described by Cameron, is about, or it describes the anxiety that is experienced by many people, which leaves them to feel personally concerned about not being different. Alienation is a feeling of estrangement or separation that individuals often may experience when they feel disconnected from themselves, or disconnected with others or within their environment. The sense of disconnection can manifest in several ways where people may feel detached from their own thoughts or their emotions, or their identity, which can lead to a sense of inner conflict or lack of understanding about themselves. People may also feel alienation in their environments. They may feel isolated from their community or society. This is usually based on due to perceived differences or a lack of acceptance by others. So ultimately, feeling a sense of isolation can lead to feelings of loneliness, exclusion, or marginalization. But it can also impact a person's mental health and their well being. Um, the anxiety can also lead people to strive to conform to norms so that they can avoid standing out. For people with disabilities, they have been often represented in ways that emphasize their perceived weaknesses, or in ways that are seen as weak or passive, powerless, childlike, and tragic. And all of these perceptions can reinforce negative stereotypes about people with disabilities, but they can also contribute to the marginalization of people with disabilities because they threaten that idea of normalcy. Um, The concept of normality or normalcy, as has evolved today, emerged along industrialization in the 19th century. As I mentioned, that this time was a time of rapid technological change and advancements with increased information flows, production growth, and significant movement of people. Um, to manage and control these changes, society began to prioritize standardization and conformity. The term normal started to be used around 1840 to describe something that conforms to or does not deviate from the common type, a standard, the regular, or the usual. This shift was discussed in Davis's article, where he talked about the adoption of normality had significant social advantages as it established a baseline for what was considerable and desirable. However, because the fact that it imposed strict requirements for conformity, this often marginalized and discriminates against those who did not fit within those narrow definitions. Through a disability studies perspective, standardization and conformity have significant implications for people with disabilities. They often shape societal structures, practices, and attitudes in ways that can produce marginalization and exclusionary practices that impact people with disabilities. Um, Standardization is the process of establishing common norms, rules, or criterias. Um, while standardization can create efficiencies and uniformities, it can also impact or create marginalization for those who are unable to fit into those established norms. So for people who have disabilities, standardization can lead to marginalization and exclusion from environments, exclusion based on barriers to accessibility, um, exclusion from opportunities or expectations for opportunities, such as through standardized testing or practices that exclude individuals. Um, Conformity involves adhering to social norms and expectations. And that means for people with disabilities that can lead to people with disabilities um, being excluded from environments if they are not able to conform to those expectations. So there's a large history of exclusion and removal from society for people who don't conform to what those norms are. So separate systems have been created for people based on what their perceived needs are, where they are removed from the expectations. For example, education system is set up in a way that it conforms. Students are taught set curriculum, and students are expected to, um, you know, meet the curriculum and behave and act in certain ways in the schools. And students with disabilities who might not fit into that norm or those standards are often placed into segregated or special education practices based on what their perceived needs are to focus on overcoming what those needs are. So conformity, the expectations to be standard and to conform in the environment can have impact people's abilities to participate in community and contribute to the marginalization of people. Adolphe Quetelet was a 19th century Belgian mathematician and astronomer who played a significant role in the development of a new social science. He applied the concept of law of error, in which astronauts used to average or determine discrepancies between measurements of celestial objects to determine what their true value was. So astronauts would measure celestial objects in the air, and many astronomers would do that, and they would use this to locate celestial objects. However, they noticed that people had different measurements for these celestial objects. So they started to take what was the average or what occurred most in order to determine what these measurements were, and therefore it became a law of averages, or known as the law of averages. Um, so this law of error, sorry, um, would be used to average discrepancies between the measurements of these objects to determine what their true value was. So he used this idea and started to apply it to human features. And in doing so, he created a new social science to determine what was a desirable human state. Um, so he applied this method of averages to analyze human characteristics. He measured the chest size of Scottish soldiers um, to dem- um, to find out what the average chest size was of these soldiers. And through determining this, he coined the term average man, which was l'homme moyen, which he described as a cosmic template for human beings. So, what this work highlighted was what occurred most often became most desirable, and averages became what people should ascribe to, or the ideal that people should desire to reach, because that was what would happen most often. So these ideals were determined, used to determine who might make good soldiers based on whatever their chest size were, and then people outside of these norms may have been perceived as not being uh, standard or part of that, or close. If they weren't close enough to the average, they were viewed differently. Um, so this is where, according to Quetelet, the individual person became synonymous with error, while the average person represented what the true human being was. So this laid the groundwork for social sciences and statistical analysis, and also and influencing the way we understand human populations and behaviors. So his work highlighted the significance of standardization and averages in assessing human attributes. The binary of normalcy, particularly in relation to people with disabilities, refers to the dichotomy between what society considers to be normal and what it views to be abnormal. This binary framework has significant implications for how people with disabilities are perceived and treated and integrated into society. So through statistical science and eugenic interests, created the idea of the norm and the normal body. Um, and therefore, the disabled body is seen as the binary opposition. Tyranny of the norm refers to the social pressure and dominance exerted by what is considered normal in society. This concept suggests that societal standards and norms can marginalize and oppress people who do not conform to them, including people with disabilities, those with different cultural backgrounds, and others with unique characteristics. Um, in essence, the tyranny of the norm enforces conformity or promotes conformity, and often leads to the stigmatization and exclusion of those who are perceived as different or deviant from accepted standards. And it highlights how powerful and persuasive societal norms can be in shaping attitudes, behaviors, and policies that impact people's lives. Um, so um, Society often constructs a standard of normalcy based on the majority's characteristics, abilities, behaviors, and expectations. So those standards then become the benchmarks against which everyone is measured. So people who can meet these benchmarks and these standards are considered to be normal. And while those who deviate then become labeled as abnormal. Um, so, um, to norm the non-standards for normalcy, you need to think about who is creating the norms, for what purpose are these norms created, what do they serve, and where are these ideas for norms coming from? Both Cameron and Davis talk about how representations of disability are portrayed through literature or other media representations. So Davis uses the example of 19th century novels of being a social practice of reinforcing the language and the dominant ideas of disability through the characters. So usually through media, there's not a overabundance of disabled characters who are just happen to have disability as a characteristic of themselves. Usually, if disability is perceived through media, it's for a reason. So whether it be to evoke feelings such as pity or horror in the character, if disability is used as a marker of some type of deviance to reinforce ideas to elicit fear in the character or reinforce negative stereotypes about the individual, or if they are included in a storyline, it's usually part of the storyline where they need to the character has a disability as part of the storyline. So usually it's something to overcome. So then the storyline is about the individual, having to overcome their disability to have an accomplishment um, or in other ways. But Usually media reinforces dominant negative portrayals of disability. And if you think about, how characters are portrayed or the absence of disabled characters through media representations, we can start to look at alternative perspectives and have more of a disability studies consciousness to alter the way that we view media or read any novel. Thank you.